Welcome back once again to Word Alive on Romans 8:28 Publishing. Truly a blessing to be standing before you again this evening. Just looking forward to continuing, and we're wrapping up yet another series that we're doing here on using our power for God's purpose. Thank God that He gives us each some power, that He gives each of us some gifts and some abilities, and that He also gives us assignments. How much easier it is for me to wake up in the morning and start my day knowing that God's got something for me to do, that I'm not just going about willy-nilly trying to do things that are just important to me, but thank God that He gives us assignments to do for His kingdom, that He trusts us enough in spite of our foolishness, in spite of our mistakes, in spite of our, let's face it, outright sin, that He still continues to use us. And thank God that He gave us people in the Bible, people that we can look up to, people that we can revere, but also people that we can see were extremely flawed, just like we are, and yet the great things that God did through them. And it gives me, I know, hope every day that God can still use me in spite of the issues that I've got going on in my life. And I pray that as we teach on these folks and the issues that they had, I pray that you see yourselves in these stories and realize that in spite of what you're going through, in spite of what you've done, God will still use you. You just got to step out there and do what He's called you to do. So we're talking now about using our power for God's purpose. We've been talking about marrying the gifts that God has given us to the assignment that He has in our lives, and just to see the difference that it makes in how our life goes. And I'm not talking about a life without trouble when we do it, but I'm talking about a life that bears more fruit, a life where we go through the battles and come out stronger because we're using our power for God's purpose. And we looked at, first of all, we looked at Samson. Samson, the very obvious power that Samson had. It was physical strength, it was fighting ability. For someone that's been called to deliver a nation, these seems like gifts that would be great and useful and really the ideal gifts to have. But we saw in Samson's life that because he never willingly went and did what God told him to do, God had to put him in these situations and have things happen in his life that created drama and just chaos to get him to do what he was called to do. And so there was this chaos-filled life. There was this selfishness about everything that he had done, that God said, I'm getting my will done. But because he didn't do it willingly, we saw just problem after problem after problem, and that drama that just drains from us without putting anything back into our lives. So that's what we had started out as. But then we looked at that last week. We looked at the beginning of Gideon's story, and we saw Gideon, a man with less obvious power that one would think of for a soldier, for a man who's going to lead an army, that he had this power of humility. Yet because he married that humility to the assignment that God had on him, because he went willingly, because he sought God as he did it, because as God gave him instruction, he followed the instructions the way that God did. We saw how his life went much more smoothly, how he was delivered from his problems much more quickly, and how his battle began much more smoothly and with God fighting before him, because he had gone where God told him to go. And so we saw this part of Gideon's life with this humility, but because he married it to the assignment that God had for him, it just was flowing nice and smooth. But we also want to acknowledge at the end of that lesson, though, that just because we are doing the best we can, even if we were walking perfectly and trying to marry our assignment, amen, and our gifts together, that it doesn't mean a life without problems. I'm not trying to stand up here and tell anybody that if you do the things that I'm teaching you to do, you're never going to have a problem, you're never going to have an issue, you're never going to have health problems, financial problems, you're never going to have an enemy that rises up against you, because we are disciples of Jesus. And there is one man that truly has married his gifts with his assignment perfectly throughout his life. And we know that he was a man well acquainted with sorrow. We know that he told us that in this world we will have trouble. He told us that if this world hates you, remember that it hated me first. So everybody's not going to love you just because you marry your assignment with the gifts that God has given you and you walk that out. There are still going to be issues that come up in our lives. And so that's what we're looking at tonight. Yes, Gideon's battle began very smoothly, but we're going to see that there are issues that still creep up. And we're going to see how important it is that as we go through those issues, that we keep using those gifts that God gave us, that we still keep walking it out God's way, because it can be a little bit easier when everything's going smoothly, when everything's okay, everything's going smooth, I'm doing it God's way, and everything's going smooth. But man, sometimes when that enemy rises up, now all of a sudden we say, you know what, maybe I need to change tactics. Maybe I need to do it more my way. Maybe I need to use some of the issues of the world, to use some of the powers of the world to deal with this, because this is an unexpected enemy rising up. And sometimes the enemy might rise up in ourselves and we can get out of character. So we're going to look tonight at Gideon as he encounters problems, as he encounters these issues that arise up in his battle, that he continues to deal with these issues with the humility that God gave him. And he doesn't fall into another bag of tricks, try using somebody else's gift, try using somebody else's ability, try using something that the world said he needs. He continues to use what God put in him in order to deal with the issues that arise. And so we see here, we begin, we're going to kind of pick up with the end of last week's, at that smooth beginning to the battle. And then we're going to pick up, it was right after that smooth beginning to the battle is where we're going to start seeing these issues rise up. And so we're going to start in Judges chapter 7, and we're going to begin at verse 19. And so it says in verse 19, it says, "So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch, and they had but newly set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers that were in their hands. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers, and held the lamps in their left hands, and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And they stood every man in his place around the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Beth Shittah in Zaretha, and to the border of Abel Maholah, and unto Tabith." So we see here again, this is that nice smooth beginning to it, right? Gideon has obeyed a battle plan that seems to make no sense, right? He's breaking pitchers, he's holding up lanterns, he's blowing trumpets, he's shouting about a sword, but he hasn't actually drawn a sword out yet. And here God has given him that smooth beginning to the battle. He has now, the enemy is in chaos, the enemy is confused, the enemy is even turning their swords on each other. And that is the beginning of the battle. And that is because God is there, and God is fighting before Gideon, because he has gone exactly as God has assigned him to do. But we see that it doesn't take long before they stop fighting each other, before they stop turning their swords on each other. And it says at the end of that, it talks about how the host fled, right? So the enemy, because God is fighting before you, is not going to just stand there and slaughter themselves throughout the whole battle. The enemy is not going to just stand there and let you take them out without fighting back, without fleeing. Now, in this case, they didn't even have the strength in their spirit to fight back, but they certainly fled. They said, we're not going to just sit here and let you slaughter us. We're going to run, and you're going to have to exert some effort now in order to pursue us and to chase us down. And so we see, and this is what I love, that as we see in this now, that smooth beginning, the 300 that God has given him to take out armies, not an army, but armies of multiple nations that have joined together against Israel. Now God has said, all right, you know what? Now they're fleeing. Now the resistance is coming up. Now the pursuit is coming up. And I love the way that Gideon responds to it. Why? Because again, it shows his humility. in that it says in verse 23, it says, and the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali and out of Asher and out of Manasseh and pursued the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and take before them the waters unto Beth-barah and the Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took to the waters unto Beth-barah and Jordan. And they took 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. And they slew Oreb upon the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they slew at the winepress of Zeb, and pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. And you may be asking, how is it that this shows his humility? Why? Because you know what? Here is Gideon, who God has called, and Gideon who has begun this great victory with just him and 300 men. And we can think about how arrogant Samson probably would have handled this, right? Arrogant Samson probably would have wanted all the glory for the victory for himself. He would have picked up like a cow femur, and he would have picked up like a donkey's jaw again, and he probably would have tried to run down all the armies by himself. He would have tried to take them all out by himself so he could get all the glory. And then you know what? About halfway through, he probably would have seen a pretty Philistine girl as he was running through the towns, and he probably would have got distracted. He would have got sidetracked. You know what? She looks pretty good. And he probably would have just stopped right in the middle, and the job never would have been finished. But we see Gideon is not going to do that. Gideon is going to call on the nations, right? Say, you know what? I don't mind sharing credit for this victory. Why? Because first of all, I don't need the credit because I'm leaning on God, and either way, God is going to get the glory. But I love this also because it also shows a compassion on the 300. Right? He started out with 32,000. And there are 300 that went into battle with him. It's also showing that respect for those 300 that are with him. Imagine 300 people trying to track down tens of thousands that are all fleeing in different directions and take them out. So it's showing a consideration. It's showing a heart for those people. And we're going to bring in some other folks now to do the mop-up duty. And we don't even have to look at just Samson. We can look at ourselves. I can't tell you how many times I have in different ministries that I've been in different ministries that I have seen and walked amongst, how often somebody starts a great project. And if they would just be willing to bring in another church, another denomination, another pastor, how great that beginning could grow, but they get territorial. No, this is my project. No, this is my thing. If I bring somebody else in, they're going to try and take it over. If I bring somebody else in, they're going to get all the credit for what it is that I've already poured so much into. But Gideon does not have that spirit. He has that spirit of humility. Look, the battle will be won. The battle is the Lord's. It doesn't need to be me that gets the credit. I'm going to call on the nations around me, not only to assure the victory, but to also give some compassion, to give some rest, to make it a little bit easier on the 300 that have followed me into this battle against all odds. And so I love the fact that he does that. But the other thing that I love is, and this is one of the interesting things, and I love how thorough God is when he gives us these stories, right? Because often we think of the resistance just coming from the enemy that we're trying to drive out, for those obstacles that we're trying to overcome. But God shows us here in this story that the enemy can come from all different places. It doesn't have to be the enemy. It could be just the circumstances of life that come up in the middle of the battle. It could be our allies. It could be our friends. It could be the very people that we're helping that rise up against us and bring the issue. It could be, let's face it, I know we don't like to admit it, but sometimes it is we ourselves that bring the problems upon ourselves when we're fighting these battles for God. And in this case, it's actually the very people that Gideon is delivering that are going to rise up and create the biggest issues in him fighting this battle. Because if we look at chapter 8 of Judges, and we're beginning at the beginning in verse 1, it says, "And the men of Ephraim said unto him, Why hast thou served us thus, that thou callest us not when thou wentest to fight the Midianites? And they chide him sharply." So here you have, I know we're doing King James Version tonight. You may be like, huh? What'd he say?
here are the very Ephraimites, right? They had an opportunity to come down. They knew there was a battle going on. They could have just walked on down and said, Gideon, can we help? But no, here the very people he's delivering are coming in and they're correcting him. They're rebuking him. Oh, because they don't like the way that he's delivering them. Oh, now look, now you've got this great victory and we didn't get included. I said everybody wants credit for it after it's already done, but not everybody wants to jump in at the beginning. And here's what we had the Ephraimites doing. And I'm going to tell you, if I was in Gideon's shoes, I think my response might be, look, it's me that God called. God didn't call you, so don't come question me about this. I'm the one that took 300 men, and I got armies, plural, multiple on the run. So don't come at me about you don't like the way that I'm slaying another army. Amen. You could have come down. All right, this might have been my response, but I thank God that it was not Gideon's response in this. And we're going to see how, again, we're going to see his response. What's it rooted in? It's rooted in, as this obstacle has now risen up against him, that his response is in the humility that God has blessed him with. Because he responds in verse 2, he says, and he said unto them, what have I done now in comparison to you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezar? God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison to you? Then their anger was abated toward him, and when he had said that. So here we see, I love it. He doesn't come back with his strength. He comes back with their strength in order to diffuse the situation. He comes back and he says, look at my land. The best of the grapes that we have doesn't compare to the leftovers of the grapes that you have in Ephraim. Who am I to even come up against you? Who am I to even ask you to do anything? Because your land is so great and so wonderful. And look, what have I done? I've slain a few soldiers, sure, but you have actually taken 2 of the princes of Midian. Who am I to come up against you? And I love it because it instantly diffuses the situation. And one of the things that I love is when I see people walking out a scripture before it has even been written. And we see here that Gideon is walking out that scripture that says, it's Psalm 15:1, that says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. It hadn't been written yet, folks, but yet here Gideon is walking it out. Gideon is exhibiting it right before us. So if he could do it before it was even written, now that we know about it, now that God has told us about it, ought we not to do the same thing? So here we see again Gideon using his superpower of humility in order to overcome a situation. Excuse me. And this may seem like a small thing, but I want to encourage you, in the battles that we face, a lot of times it's these small skirmishes that pop up on the side that distract us from the mission that God has given us, that create the biggest problems. A lot of times it's not the enemy even fighting back against us, but we're chasing the enemy, and all of a sudden this little thing pops up over here, and I am very guilty of this. There's something pops up on the side, and we start dealing with that thing. We get distracted from that thing. It takes us away from the focus on what God has given us to do. So don't take it lightly, and don't think a small thing that Gideon handled this the way that he did, because it kept him from getting engaged and bringing on an ally and turning them into an enemy. But instantly now, not only does it keep them from creating a further problem, but now they're feeling so good about themselves that they're going to go out and they're going to work harder and they're going to fight harder and they're going to do more. So we want to make sure that as we go through these battles, as we go through them God's way, that's what I love about him, is he makes sure that those allies stay allies for us and don't become a deterrent to our battle. And of course, that's not the only issue that poor Gideon's going to have as he's pursuing these Midianites. Because we see in verse 4, it says, and Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, he and the 300 men that were with him, faint, yet pursuing them. Other translations have put it as exhausted. not just fatigued, not just a little worn out, not even just tired, but exhausted. They're running on fumes, they're running on empty, because now we see that the battle does take effort, and that battle can drain us, that battle can wear us out, and that we need sustenance. And I'm not even talking about necessarily food as sustenance, but we need that spiritual sustenance in order to bring us through the battle. So what we might be looking at in that point is not necessarily a meal, but maybe we need to get into our word a little bit more. Maybe we need to get into prayer a little bit more. Maybe we need to lock ourselves away with some praise and worship music. Maybe we need to go have some fellowship with some other believers who are going to encourage us, who are going to lift us up, who are going to help to carry us through the battle, who are going to revive us, restore us, and renew our energy as we pursue, as we seek the victory that God has for us. And so here he is, he's pursuing, and we see that it's not all easy, it's not all smooth, that there is resistance, and now we're seeing fatigue is starting to set in. We're seeing that a wearing out is starting to set in the people that have come through. So they are exhausted, but yet I love it because they're tired, they're exhausted, but yet they are pursuing. They are persevering. And that's why I think there's so many scriptures on perseverance in the scripture. Not only so we can rejoice in our suffering, because it produces perseverance, which produces character, which produces hope, and our hope will not disappoint us. And we see here now, so he's continuing to pursue on, and there are two kings that he's pursuing. He's pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, two of the kings of Midian. And we see that, again, fresh issues are going to arise as his people are fatigued. And the issues, again, are not even going to be from the enemy initially, right? The issues are going to be from his allies, from his friends, from the very people he's delivering. Because it says that he comes across two towns as he's pursuing these enemies, and his army is fatigued. And he comes across these two towns of Succoth and Peniel, and he goes to these towns, and he says, look, I'm not even asking you to come out and fight. I'm not asking you to come pursuing with me. Just let us have a little bit of bread and a little bit of water. And he gets this mocking response from them that says, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? And I can just imagine what would rise up in my spirit. I'm exhausted, I'm tired, and I'm doing something for you, and you can't even give me a piece of bread. But again, we see here that he does not get in himself about it. He doesn't get in his feelings about it. He doesn't cause an issue, but his response is just, he says, when the Lord gives them into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. And I love it because he says, when. He says when there is when. Look, I'm not going to deal with this now. I got no time for you now because God has me on an assignment. Again, not getting distracted by these other little things that flare up, but staying focused on the assignment. But when God, and I love this too, because this displays his response here, the true humility that God has put in. And here again, he's using that humility in order to avoid another struggle, to avoid another battle, to avoid something that's going to take him off course. Because he says, when, not when I get victory, not when I capture these kings, but when the Lord gives them into my hand, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to deal with you after that is all said and done. Because God has an assignment. He's not going to deal with anything else to us in common. But I love that when, because it shows the confidence. And it's that true humility. If you remember last week, we talked about that true humility. Sometimes we get this arrogance where when I do it, or we get this low self-esteem of, I can't do it. But here is the true humility. When I do it through God's power. When God uses me to do this thing, that's the humility we're talking about. Not the I can't do it, not I'm not worthy. God has already told me I'm worthy, and I'm confident in the fact that I'm worthy, but it is when God gives them into my hand. That true humility is what he's walking in, and we see him using it over and over again. Not the I will do it arrogance, not the I can't do it low self-esteem, but the humility of when God does it through me. So here again, we see again, he's married in the issues that arise through the battle. He is again marrying his assignment and his gift together in order to keep them from sidetracking him or distracting him. And it's that continued singular focus now. He goes on to pursue these kings. And we see that now what happens, there are about 15,000 soldiers left. And we see that these two kings, they've gone and they've kind of set up in the town, and now there is another battle, because now Gideon and his 300 still have 15,000 to defeat to get to the king. So it's not that God isn't going to make them still fight some folks. It's not that he's still not going to have some battles against the enemy. The enemy didn't even just run, but eventually they realized, you know what, we've got to stop and fight if we want to survive. But we see again that because he has done it faithfully, because he has done it with that singular focus, he and his 300 men defeat what is remaining of the armies of Midian. And we see that he now has captured the two kings, and he has brought them back, and he has accomplished what God has told him to do. Not without issue, not without problems, but we see again, not without the chaos and the side trails and the backtracking and the redoing and the unnecessary conflicts that we saw so prevalent in Samson's life, because he didn't keep focused on the purpose that God gave him his power for. And so we see that now he has gone and done these things, but we can also learn a little bit of the flip side from Gideon as well. Just as we talked about the issues that Samson had, right? And the fact that he went and tried to do everything in his own power and in his own time, and he wasn't walking obediently. But we saw in Samson that after he had hit his lowest point, after he had his eyes plucked out, after he was being chained and mocked, we saw that he finally came to his senses and he prayed to God. He said, God, give me my strength back just one more time. And we saw in that the beauty of the fact that it's never too late. We saw the beauty of the fact that he had his greatest victory. He slayed the most of Philistines that he had in all his battles when he finally turned back to God at the end and said, God, I know you're the source of my power. So we saw how Samson had kind of gotten it all wrong most of his life, but at the end, he got it right. He got it right, and he had his greatest victory because he had turned back to God. And we could almost see a little bit of the flip side in Gideon here. And so I want to stress to you that after the big battle is over, after you've accomplished that great thing that God has for you, there are pitfalls that can rise up against you down the line. And that's what Gideon's going to show us. That's where Gideon failed. Gideon overcame great, powerful armies, but yet he got caught by maybe one of the most dangerous traps that the devil sets for us, and that is the trap of success. That trap when the battle's over, when you've done everything so faithfully, when God has given you that complete and total victory, and people start patting you on the back and saying, great job, look at what you did, and you hear it over and over. You start to think, you know what, yeah, I did do that, didn't I? Because you just hear it over and over. And we're going to see that in Gideon, that he falls into a little bit of the trap of success that he has. Because now what he does, now that the battle's over, he has, as was the tradition, the soldiers now have taken plunder off of their enemies, and each one is given him a gold ring, a gold earring, some piece of gold that they've taken off their enemy. And what Gideon does is he creates an ephod out of this gold, out of all this gold that he has brought together. And what it says in verse 27 of chapter 8 of Judges, it says, and Gideon made an ephod thereof, and put it in his city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither, a whoring after it, worshiping this ephod that he had set up. And it said, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and his house. So here, now what's happening now, that God that he trusted on, that God that he leaned on, that God that gave him the victory, now what's happening, he's got people worshiping a gold ephod in his hometown that he sets up, and people start worshiping that thing. And so what happens, we see it becomes a snare. And what's that mean? It becomes a problem to him. It means that it's causing problems for him, his family, his nation, because it has led them into disobedience. He has now walked away from the humility that God has given us. And we may not set up a gold ephod, and we may not put it on display, and we may not have people come worship after it, but you know what? We start worshiping that victory that God gave us. We start worshiping that house that came about as a result of the victory. We start worshiping the praise that came about as the victory. And we start, instead of keeping and pursuing after the next thing that God has for us, we start basking in the glow of that thing that he has already done. So I want to encourage you. Gideon is a great example. We see how faithfully he married his assignment and his purpose. But we see also that none of us is perfect. And we see that he falls into that snare. He falls into that trap of worshiping the success rather than the God that gave him the success. That he starts worshiping the gift rather than the giver. That gold ephod was the gift of the plunder. And he starts to worship that instead of the God that gave him the victory that led to the plunder, that led to all that gold. So we've got to make sure of this thing. So I just want to encourage you as we kind of wrap up this lesson on using our power for God's purpose. Just keep in mind the lessons that we learn, that when we do marry our gifts to God's assignment, that there is a difference, not that the battle is without struggle, but there is a difference in the drain that it has on us, that battle, when we're marrying our assignment and our gifts, that there is less chaos in our lives, that there is less hostility in our lives, that there is more of a peace in our lives, that even in the midst of a sorrow that we can have joy, even in the midst of a battle we can have peace when we marry our assignment to our purpose. We can see that when we continue, as problems arise in the battle, when we continue to use the gifts that God has given us the way that they were intended to deal with those other issues that arise, that they don't become another snare, that they don't become a side battle that distracts us from the thing that God has given us to do. But we can also take encouragement from Samson and what we learned from him, that it is never too late. It is never too late if you have gone down the wrong path, if you're going through the battle the wrong way, if you haven't taken on the battle that God has assigned for you yet. It's never too late to say, you know what, God, I see the gifts that you give me. I see the power that you put in me. I know you are the source of them. Turn back to him and you will see your greatest accomplishments. You will see your greatest victory. You will start to have that peace that you can have in the middle of the battle. You'll start seeing the joy that you can have in the midst of the sorrow. So it's never too late. We learned that from Gideon, to turn around, turn back to God, and he will be faithful to see you through it, to bring you through it, and to give you your greatest victory. And then, like I said, as we learned from Gideon, after you get that victory, it's not done. And unless you have that victory and you go on to glory right after it's done, you know what? There is going to be some patting on the back. There's going to be some congratulations. There's going to be, look at what you did. Don't fall for it. Don't fall into it, because it will become a snare unto you. It will become an issue. Here, the glory that you've received is going to become an issue. Congratulations, you got the pat on the back. Congratulations, you've gotten the accolades. Congratulations, you have the certificate hanging on your wall. Congratulations, you have a gold ephod set up in your city, all right? But it will become a snare to you if you start worshiping that instead of the one that brought you to the victory. So I pray that this has been a blessing to you. I pray that you have been encouraged by this lesson. If you have, I just want to encourage you again. We do have these. You can watch these. These will stay on Facebook for a while. So share it with your friends. Share it with your family members. Or you can also go to Romans 8:28 Publishing. In a couple of days, we'll have this entire series up on there. So if you missed part of it, you can go back and watch the whole thing, beginning to end. Get it all, because we gave some things from the past, but there's still some nuggets in there that you could be blessed by. So I just want to encourage you, have a blessed day in the Lord. Never forget that Jesus loves you, and so do we. Have a blessed